Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Better Body Radio, and today is a team episode hosted by myself, Ross Gilmore, co-founder of Better Body Collective, and today I'm joined by one of our senior coaches, Charles Barkley. Today we touch on a very interesting area of discussion, this idea of social comparison, what we see on social media, all the smoke and mirrors, everyone's highlight reel, and the constant comparison that many people might be making to their own day-to-day everything reel, and really only seeing the good side that people want us to see and portray. And that goes on a nice segue in towards this idea of identity and where we attach the majority of our identity. And in a nutshell, I guess the importance of taking the actions of the person that we want to become rather than waiting to become that person and then everything else falling into place. So grab your favorite beverage. I think we're really, you're going to enjoy this one. But it's been a few weeks since we've hopped on and done one of these. Well overdue, I think.
I think so.
So I think we're going to come in and talk about a bit of, well, we'll start with the thing I had on my mind, and then the second topic is also incredibly juicy as well. So I'm actually quite looking forward to recording both of these. But how are you doing, Charlie? What's been going on?
Not bad. Just been taking a 4-day sort of mini diet break and then a 5 days off training as well. So I'm feeling very refreshed, as in like the back end of a training cycle, and it must have been at least 4 diet cycles as well. So it's definitely feeling the effects and feeling very kind of just tired and run down. But I feel it's like that good sign of a rest when I'm excited to train tomorrow. So in a good position to push again.
Yeah, the psychological and physiological benefits you get from those breaks. Was that about 16 weeks, or was it more than that?
Yeah, 16 weeks. Yeah.
Because you tend to run 4-week mesos, right? Generally speaking.
Yeah. 4 or 5.
Sweet. So yeah, I think 16 weeks, and given that it's probably still a while away, like how many weeks are you out now from
about 20, I think. Yeah. So I've still got time.
It's a good long old stab. Like when you think about all in, it's going to be somewhere in the region of 35 to 40 weeks. It's a good old long.
Yeah, it's not. You're not going to do that in one hit. It'd be foolish.
No, definitely sure. Well, let's get into today's topic. So I kind of mentioned to you when we were off the recording about a message that I got from a client this week, and it spurred on a really cool topic, I suppose, of conversation. And it's a bit of a kind of multi-sprung, kind of multi-directional conversation that can go in, and you could talk about these two things separately, but I do think they intertwine incredibly well as well. And the first part of it is going to be essentially the idea of almost like social comparison syndrome, where listen, we know what our industry is like. We're in a world nowadays where people just have to open up that app, that shiny, orangey, purpley app, and just start having a scroll through all these incredible physiques and all these people with their different protocols and their training and their nutrition and their cheat meals and all the things that are going on. And the first thing that they start maybe looking at is, right, well, this person is ripped. They're ripped all the time. They're ripped all year round. And why is it they can do X, Y, and Z, or it appears that they don't do X, Y, and Z? For example, the exact example my client gave is, what is it about all these people who never track and they don't go through these separate specific phases, yet they're ripped all year round? Why is that? I've always just been so curious. So I thought it'd be cool for us to kind of touch on that a little bit, and potentially some of the pitfalls and dangers of that social comparison syndrome that people can develop, where they're always looking at everyone else's highlight reel, but making themselves feel very inferior when they're comparing someone's highlight reel to their everything reel. And that's a bit of a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's your initial, I'll let you kind of lead off on this. What's your initial take just from people? And you've obviously had this from your clients as well. In fact, even as coaches and trainers, I think we've all suffered this. We look at people who are, really successful, or, where we want to be business-wise and all those things. And it's so easy to get yourself dragged into that. What do you think some of the things you've seen from your clients are that they've mentioned to you about?
Yeah, I think the biggest standout to me, and I've had this myself when I first started like getting into training, but then also for kind of typically like more beginner or younger clients seeing this kind of thing. And the first thing that jumps out to me is just like they're comparing themselves to people who've had skin in the game for a long time. So, if you've got someone who's trained for 10 years, and has kind of got their body into a place they're fairly happy with, then why not maintain? If they're not a professional bodybuilder where you do need to get better year on year, that people who are in that position, who've put the time in, why not have that kind of maintenance physique that most people would be really happy with as a peak physique? Let's be honest.
Mm.
But they've put that time in where they have that muscle mass, which inevitably means they're going to have a higher calorie intake generally, so they can get away with more. They have more wiggle room. Um, so both in terms of how they look, what they're eating or what they claim to be eating, and their claimed expenditure and stuff, it is going to be potentially sort of higher intake, lower expenditure. But you've not seen those years where they've probably been through some cyclical stuff. They've been where you are. So that's the first thing you've got to remember. If you're comparing yourself to someone who's had years of skin in the game, it's not going to be you can't do that comparison without doing yourself a big disservice.
Yes, I always like to use the analogy. It's kind of like if you're looking at a book, don't compare your chapter 1 to someone's chapter 20.
Yeah,
Just doesn't make any sense, right?
none at all. It's just it'll only drive you mental. And then the other thing that you touched on before we started was, and it definitely confirms the highlight reel is, how do you know?
Exactly. How do you know? And that's the thing. A lot of people often say, well, this guy can do X, Y, and Z, and they're going to do this, and they're going to do that. It's like, well, here's a couple of things to think about. One, you don't know where they came from. They could have started off from being like, I think Carter Guzzo is a really interesting example. So a lot of people look at him and he's like, he's not a bodybuilder physique, but he's a guy who's in relatively good shape. Just like most general pop people would just be quite happy to have a bit of muscle, be fairly lean, and have a really good, flexible approach to nutrition, for example. But often, and obviously Carter does share this story quite often, but you look at where he came from, for example, and he was incredibly overweight. And so people see where he is now. It's like, oh, but it's easy for you. It's like, you don't know what they had to go through to get to that point. Like you say, all the cyclical periods where they actually had to go through the struggles, the falling off the wagon, the get to a point where they had to forge all those habits that have ultimately ended up making them who they are now. That didn't happen by accident or overnight. That took time to arise at. The other thing as well, though, is like you might think someone isn't tracking, but how do you know? Like it might not be something they post about, but they could easily be doing that. And even if they aren't doing that, the point I made off air to you is like, well, just what they do for their physique has absolutely no bearing on what you need to do for your own physique. So again, it's just the idea of, fine, it's nice to look up to people. It's nice to get an idea of different people's thought processes, different people's methodologies and approaches. Definitely having insight and ideas can be really useful. It can spark, it can spark insight, and it can spark potentially, oh, I've never thought of it that way. Maybe I'm going to give that a try. But that's only as helpful as it gets. If you start letting it go too far as to, well, this guy does that, why can't I achieve that? Then that's where we're starting to tip over that very unresourceful edge. And the other point you touched on off air, which I thought was really important, is a lot of people that you think, like, I think there's two parts to this. There's not everyone who's in shape and who's lean and muscular is on gear. And that's the first thing I want to make clear. So I think you'd be amazed how many people, like, even this time around, I'm not even that lean yet, but I remember the last time I got lean, and this wasn't even for competing. I had so many people come up and say, are you on gear? It's probably the first time they saw me in a tank top, essentially looking a bit lean. And the first thing they think is, are you on stuff? It's like, not everyone is on gear. However, there are quite a lot of people, and even some people you might not suspect, who are actually utilizing anabolics or androgens or, TRT or whatever it is. And so there are people who you're comparing yourself potentially as a natty lifter, and they're not. And so that's also something you have to be really careful with as well, is that you might be comparing almost in a way, I don't like to use the term apples to oranges, but the physiological environment is almost, it's not really the same playing ground, the same playing field, really.
No, that's it. The biggest comparison there will be, someone who just enjoys their training, wants to get bigger and stronger and leaner over time, comparing themselves to, a professional bodybuilder. That's always going to be a nightmare comparison, where you are comparing someone with just a completely different physiological makeup to yourself, and that's going to be really challenging to keep up with, because that is someone who can stay almost effortlessly lean because they're running hotter than most people are anyway. But then off the back of the tracking thing, when people say, oh, this person doesn't track and doesn't do that, they generally 99 times out of 100 fall into two categories. And they're either people who have tracked before for a long time, so their barometer is excellent, like they really understand what their body needs. They understand how their hunger signaling, they understand what their maintenance is, they understand, what making good food choices are. So, okay, maybe they don't track now, but they probably have for a long time. Or they fall into a more contentious category, at least I find it a bit more contentious, where they've always been fit and lean. And they claim, oh, you don't need to track to be fit and lean. It's like, no, you don't need to track to be fit and lean because you've never struggled with anything with your body, which is, I mean, really good for you. Honestly, good for them. Like, I'm happy, obviously, they're in a good place, but trying to use that advice to help other people is really, honestly, borderline damaging. Like, for myself, I'm a really good example. Like, when I've been really skinny as a kid, if I've gone to someone who's just like, oh, just eat clean and train hard and do this cardio, I mean, that I would just be skinny. Like, just from, if I only ate clean, there's no way I'd be getting enough calories to gain weight. That's just the brutal honesty of it. Is equally with someone who's overweight, and you've got someone saying you don't need to track, you just need to eat this and that. If they've got really poor hunger signaling, they don't really understand portion control, they don't really understand what good food choices are, they're just going to be spinning their wheels and getting frustrated. But it's that n=1, where n=1 is a bit of a nightmare, because that person preaching that advice of never having to track is, yeah, they just only really have their own experience to go off, which is not probably very helpful for your own experience.
Definitely, you literally beat me to the punch for that. I mean, I think
Oh.
as far as the whole barometer thing, like, just because, and the example I use is, we talked about the whole ostrich syndrome, where people think if I just dig my head in the sand, then it doesn't matter and it doesn't exist. But that can also happen for people, like you say, who have already been effortlessly, for them, able to stay in shape. And then people where it's not quite the same for them, they then go, but that guy does that. And then, like you say, because they say, well, this is what works for me, you can do it this way too. It's like, well, not really. Like, anyone who's had their skin in the game for a long time from a coaching standpoint knows that the inter-individuality between individuals in terms of what people can get away with flexibility wise and what others can and can't do is really not the case. And the thing I always say to people as well, though, is just because they're not tracking calories, and that's why it's such a key point made about the barometer, calories are always in play, energy balance is always in play, whether you choose to track it or not. It's always there. It's always there. And so the only thing that those guys are doing well is that, why can they stay lean all year round? Well, they've found, first of all, they've done the work to get to that shape first. That's number one. And people forget that. They've done the work to get there first. Secondly, they've just found a maintenance set of habits, routines, intake, and output that is essentially work for them. And like you said, because their barometer around not just their intake, but all the other things around that, like knowing when to eat a little bit more, knowing when to eat a little bit less, they've almost developed that really good intuitive eating barometer based on their needs, their activity. If they do a bit more one week, somehow they naturally find a way to end up eating a little bit more, being a bit more flexible. But that takes time. And that also is very different between individuals. Some individuals can do that exceptionally well. Actually, I would say that Mal and I have always done a pretty good job of maintaining our weight / physique. In fact, Mal's probably one of the best examples I know. It is ridiculous how well she can do that. But there's another factor that creeps into that as well. Her range, from a maintenance standpoint, she has a very big maintenance range. So she can eat quite a wide range of calories and still maintain her weight quite well. I'm not quite so lucky. I can't quite have quite as much of a range. I have to keep it a little bit more consistent for my maintenance habits than say she does. And then I'm able to maintain my weight fine. So yeah, I think those are massively key points. It's people have developed their own barometers, and actually for most people, you're going to have to spend time tracking and doing the work first to develop those skills. Then you can move towards those people that you see are acting more like that, where, right, this has now become part of who you are. This has become part of your routine, and now you've got all those things in place. You can start to remove the tracking away. And I think you spoke about this, I think at the summit that we just spoke at as well, was we don't want to necessarily track forever either. So the problem is people want to be in one or two camps. It's like, well, either I'm going to be one of those people that eats intuitively and I never track because that's bad or damaging or will give you food this relationship issues and all that stuff, or I'm going to be that person that always tracks, and there's no way I can ever possibly have a meal without understanding exactly every gram of carb, fat, and protein that's in it. And that's not great either. So it's kind of knowing that actually it's a skill to be able to do both incredibly well. You have to practice both to get good at both.
Yeah, that's the goal, should really be to have both tools in your toolbox. Like, that is, because then maintenance is reasonably effortless. You can just kind of hang out and do fun things. And then when you want to make a change, you can pull out MyFitnessPal or chronometer, quickly whip up your kind of any changes you're going to make. Just make sure you're in the ballpark. Okay, done, and then leave it. Like even for me now, but and this is again a bit of an N=1 argument, but still, it's a good example of how you can use tracking, like track really diligently, and then use it to not have to use that so much. Like I'll really only track 1 day a week, because I do that kind of, I then repeat that cycle at least 5 or 6 other days of the week. And then you sort of have that understanding of like being able to free up a little bit of bandwidth to start giving yourself that confidence around food and food choices that leads you into the sort of more intuitive style of eating. I think the mistake people make is they think they've got to go from tracking 7 days a week to tracking 0 days a week. And there's, like anything, there's a gap of things to be filled in there, like a good example is going from your 7 days a week to maybe you just track 5 days a week at perhaps a slightly lower calorie intake, and then feel out for the weekend. Or you track 1 day a week, repeat it, track once every fortnight. You can start just lowering the frequency of your tracking until you get comfortable with things. Whereas I think, again, going back to that ostrich syndrome, when people just put the tracking away, that also takes some of the handbrake off, and it doesn't leave them accountable to anything. So, then you come into that point of what doesn't get measured doesn't get managed. I think I've butchered that slightly, but out of sight, out of mind. Okay, well, I haven't tracked it, so therefore it has 0 calories. You get into this a little bit of a dangerous situation with that as well. So it can swing both ways, and like most things, I think that middle ground is kind of where you want to be.
Definitely. And I think that then leads us on to probably the next part as well, though, is that there's a second component that ties into all of this, as far as the, okay, there's the kind of taking ownership, and there's the, comparison syndrome that's there. But a big part of it, that at least that I see with people, is people who seem to be just, they crack on, they take action, they're able to get all these things in place, is that ultimately they've appreciated that for them to go from one place to then end up in a different place, they have to have an identity shift. And there's a lot of great books out there that talk about this. We mentioned it on the summit that we did as well. We talked about the Maxwell Maltz book, the Psycho-Cybernetics. And it's that kind of story of the plastic surgeon. And I think it's such a great example, actually, in a profession to see that play out, because what are people looking to do? I'm not happy with how I look. I want to make a cosmetic change. And you get these group of people who make the cosmetic change, and that was what did the job for them. They're just like, yeah, I'm happier now with how I physically feel. That's actually lifted my self-confidence, and I feel good about that. That's great for those people. And that's kind of like those people that are like, okay, well, they found something that gave them that little edge, or made them feel better about themselves. Sweet. But then you've got that group of people who they get the plastic surgery and nothing changes. They're still miserable. They still, don't like who they are. They don't like how they're looking. It becomes a vicious circle. And I think part of that, a lot of it comes down to, is that ultimately what's happened for the people who had the surgery is they've had an identity shift. They feel like they became that person they want to be. Whereas that change superficially wasn't enough for that other group, because the change has to come from inside. It has to come from who they see themselves and how they want to be. So I think that's probably a next important part to touch on. I think you mentioned something at the fitness summit that was really useful, because we kind of ran everyone through the 5 stages. And this is just to circle back a little bit to the thing you were saying about the goal of having tracking and not tracking, and how it can be actually a sense check tool as well. And it can be something you use intermittently, and it can be everything from tracking 7 days a week to just protein and calories only, and all the other stuff. We kind of run people through, and for those that are listening and maybe don't know our coaching process, we kind of have these 5 phases, and it kind of runs pretty much like there's priming, which gets people into the right place mentally, psychologically, habit-wise, training-wise, gets them in a place where they're really robust and ready to tackle like a hard training phase. They can then usually they'll go into a transform phase. So they'll get in the best shape they've ever been in from a conditioning perspective. They'll lose body fat and really build or hold on to muscle tissue. Then they'll reverse that out of that, and they'll build themselves back up to maintenance. And then when they're at maintenance, they need to consolidate there. And then ultimately that is the maintenance part, is the end game. And at that stage, we usually teach them a lot about, right, well, you've now created a new identity for yourself. So I knew this was going to circle back. It was worth going through that. So you've created that new identity for yourself. You've created the habits that align with that identity, with your new core values. Now we can start to take away a little bit of that tracking, because you don't identify as that person who did all of those other habits before. Now you're now that person who, generally speaking, eats protein with most meals. You get your veggies in daily. You cover your kind of micronutrition, your macronutrition, and your sleep's in a pretty decent spot most of the time. Your social life is pretty well managed most of the time. It's not all or nothing. It's just like you're ticking the boxes more often than not, just out of sheer habit, because it's who you are, versus being maybe that person who forced their way through a physique transformation, got lean, and then ends up way back at square one or worse, because there wasn't the identity shift that then moved along with that. But I quite like the way that you summed it up, and I think it'd be good. I kind of wanted you to share that with the listeners as well. I really like the way that you summarized it, because I think people, all the stuff that I just said now, it's very long and it seems like quite a long drawn out process and it's very abstract, but the way you summed up was really, really succinct. Can you just share that with listeners?
So most people say they have a weight loss goal or a body fat loss goal, and they think, if I can just reach that goal, I'll be the person that I want to be. Like everything will align once I get there. I just have to get there. When in actual fact, it's the opposite way around. You need to become, at 15 kilos heavier, the person who is 15 kilos lighter, and then you'll get to that place. So it's first become, or first be, and then you'll become. Whereas everyone kind of wants to become that thing, and then they'll just magically be that thing, which is really where having a priming type phase in your transformation journey is so powerful, because that's where you're setting up a lot of that beat. You're putting yourself into a position where you already do a lot of the things required to achieve the transformation, which makes the transformation quite effortless, not only from a mindset standpoint, but from a physical standpoint. You don't feel like you're having to push yourself to do all these things. If you've never done 10,000 steps a day, if you've never had a good sleep routine, if you've never had good food choices, it's going to be really challenging to just force yourself to do that. Whereas if you've spent a month or two sort of easing into that and getting your head around what that really involves, it's relatively, it's not always effortless, but it's relatively less effort than it was before. I think it's where so many people fall short, is just trying to beat their head against the brick wall of trying to make this happen. Like, just if I can get 5 more kilos off, everything will happen. But that's not going to cover up bad sleeping habits. It's not going to cover up, making poor food choices and lacking that kind of commitment to the cause when you're just forcing it. And if you can let it become part of you, it will become more natural. It will be an easier journey.
100%. I'm going to grab a couple of books quickly, guys.
Yeah, there's a few absolutely cracking books that can help kind of just get you into that mindset shift.
Yeah, so I mean, the first one I think it'd just be good for the guys who are watching on YouTube, and we want to obviously promote the people to come and watch the podcast on YouTube as well. So there you go. If you want to see these books, what they look like, not just what they sound like in terms of the names, then worth having a look. So this is the first one. It's Maxwell Maltz. Probably shouldn't cover his name. Psycho-Cybernetics. This was recommended to me by Dan Smith, who's the head coach at M10. And obviously, Dan's really, really well known for exactly that part. This is the mindset, the identity component. And it's huge, really having a bit of a think about who do you want to become. And exactly what you said sums up perfectly, is you don't wait to become that person, then you'll be happy, or wait to become that person, then all the things will fall into place. You have to put the things in place first, and then you will become that person. And it's kind of like I really like, there was a Will Smith quote that I heard, and it was like, you don't start by just, building the wall. It's like, you don't focus on building the wall. Oh, you start by laying the perfect brick. You focus on laying that brick as perfectly as a brick can be laid, and soon you'll have a wall. And so it's exactly that. It's like one brick at a time, lay those foundations, and over time you become that person you want to be. Part of that is going to be getting your habits in place. So this is another next book, Atomic Habits by James Clear. Again, I keep covering the author's names, which is not useful at all. And I know that's obviously in reverse as well. You actually see this. You have to be good at reading back to front. The other one I actually recommended, and actually was, this is part of where I started coaching our own new coach to the Better Body team, Emma, this past week. So we had our first week check-in this past week, and we were talking exactly about that, habits. And another great book that's worth looking at as well, if you've already read James Clear's one, is Atomic Habits, which you remember Charles doing as well. And and that's a great one because it talks a bit about the physiology behind habit change as well, what's happening from a neurotransmitter perspective and what's happening in the brain, and like risk and reward and all that sort of stuff. And so those are really, really worth looking at for sure. And I think probably a last point probably to finish this episode on is this ties the two of these things really nicely together. Obviously, people are constantly comparing, right? Well, I got really good results, but this person got shredded. I want to look like that. Like they look insane. The thing we've also got to remember as well, and this ties really well back to identity, which of course is going to be composed of a lot of things, but part of that is going to be your core beliefs and values. One thing we have to understand as well is that, if you look at like a professional bodybuilder, a physique athlete, even a personal trainer who this is literally what they do day in, day out. And I say a personal trainer, not all personal trainers are into that. Obviously, there's so many PTs in terms of what they offer and how they help people. But certainly what we focus on would be mostly the body composition, with some of the other holistic parts kind of tied into that as well. Ultimately, you have to ask yourself is the amount of sacrifice that you have to be willing to give up to get to a certain condition, does that align with who you are right now? And does that align with your core beliefs and values? If you feel like you're someone who, like, actually, I thought I wanted that, but actually I don't feel that's right for me right now. It doesn't mean it won't ever be right for you, but you always just have to ask yourself that question. Okay, I see this guy, and actually, if you had to look behind the curtain, which you can't see with a highlight reel sometimes, is he doesn't socialize. He doesn't go out on weekends, doesn't drink, doesn't have many meals out. He lives a very solitary life, and he has a very small circle of friends, and most of those are based around when he goes to the gym and might be his clients. And so you've got to understand, like, well, what do you want your life to look like? If your life involves, I want to go out at the weekend, enjoy food with my family and friends, have a couple of drinks, I want to be able to have more flexibility, more social inclusion, then it doesn't mean that you can't have some of that with being that other person as well. But we're just trying to draw more extremes. If you're looking at a guy on social media who doesn't do any of that stuff, but you want all of those things, and he's willing to make those sacrifices, but you're not, you can't expect the results of the work you didn't do or the things you're not willing to give up. So that's also a part of it as well, just tying those two things together. Don't get stuck on the comparison syndrome because it's so many layers to this. You got to run your own race.
Yeah, that's it. Run your own race. It's unfortunately the boring answer, but it's true because, if you're kind of stuck trying to chase someone else's dream, you're probably just not really going to end up working on your own, which is always a bit of an issue.
Becomes a nightmare, you could say. There you go. See what I did there. So I think that's probably a good way to sign that off. So I guess just for everyone who's listening, obviously the best way you can support the podcast is head over and leave us a review if you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts. Of course, if you listen to this on Stitcher, Spotify, one of those other platforms, take a screenshot, tag us in your stories. Also, feel free to shoot me, Charlie, or even the Better Body page. Like, shoot us a direct message on social. Let us know if there's anything that we said in this episode that you're like, yeah, that really resonated with me. That was something that really hit a spot. So if you could do that for us, everyone that's listening, we'd highly, highly appreciate it. Anything else you want to add, Charlie, before we go?
No, all good.
Sweet. Until the next one.